Well, good morning, everyone, and it's so exciting to be here. My name is Bobby Rauch. I'm going to be talking about GIFShell, some research that I did a few months back. You may have seen it in the press and Bleeping Computer and across Twitter. So excited to be here and dive more into the technical details of that research. So who am I? My name is Bobby Rauch. I'm from the United States. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. I work as a red teamer on an internal red team for a Fortune 500 company in the States. I am a co-host of the Cyber Idiots podcast, where me and some other OffSec folks chat about everything OffSec and InfoSec. I studied computer science at MIT, and I now live in Boston still. And you may have seen some of my prior research, as I mentioned, this research, which was in Bleeping Computer, and a few years back, I did this research around this Good Samaritan attack in the Apple AirTag that was covered by Brian Krebs. So you may be wondering, where did this idea come from for Microsoft Teams and GIFs? It's sort of a wild idea. So Microsoft Teams and novel C2s are nothing new. There's been years of leveraging, common internal corporate tools for covert communications within corporate environments. But there were some interesting behaviors I had observed over the years, particularly with Microsoft Teams. And as Microsoft Teams grew in popularity through the pandemic, and I believe now it's utilized by something like 80% of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, the popularity really grew, but there wasn't sort of that dedicated focus of security on the product, despite the fact of how quickly widespread it had become. And as I had mentioned, there were some interesting behaviors in Teams that I thought might be worth looking into further. First of all, one time I was communicating with a client. I was in a consulting firm communicating with an external firm that also was utilizing Microsoft Teams. And suddenly we were exchanging Teams messages back and forth, despite the fact that we were two separate organizations or two separate Microsoft tenants. So I thought that was interesting. Secondly, I was once working on a client engagement, and I was exchanging payloads, messaging with a colleague in Microsoft Teams, and I accidentally included a link to like a Burp Collaborator URL, and at the end of that URL, it was my Burp Collab URL, and at the end it said, test.gif. And suddenly I got an IP lookup back, not from my colleague in Boston who I sent the message to, but rather from some Microsoft server that was in Brazil. So I thought that was interesting and potentially looking into further. And then over the years, there had been several stories by other security research firms, including firms like TrustWave and Positive Security, and they had been highlighting over the years some of the potential issues that occurred in Microsoft Teams, such as the fact that they're not as private as you might think, they're logging them in plain text, URLs are not being properly scanned as they should be, but there was never any sort of larger story that came out of it. There were sort of these one-offs and just the fact that, hey, maybe Microsoft Teams isn't the most secure product. So given that, given the interesting behavior around GIFs, I wanted to try and craft essentially an entire attack chain that involved both covert communications utilizing GIFs and also delivering a stager to a victim in a very convincing way, potentially leveraging some vulnerabilities that occurred in Microsoft Teams. So this is a high-level overview of the attack chain that I'm going to walk through today. Shout out to Anton from Assurgent Security. He actually did an analysis of my research and crafted a diagram of my research that was far better than the one I had made, so I took his. So essentially it starts with delivering a stager, which we'll walk through Microsoft Teams. The second part is essentially covert communications and delivery of commands that you want executed disguised within a GIF. Those GIFs then get logged in plain text on any Windows, Mac, or Linux machine. So essentially the stager scans through those Teams logs looking for incoming GIFs, executes the commands that it sees. It then sends a stager back to a Microsoft Teams webhook, which we're going to cover as well. And within that webhook payload, essentially there's a link to a GIF that points back to the attacker's server. Microsoft then tries to render this GIF on behalf of the user by looking it up from one of their servers. and then essentially that out-of-bound lookup of that GIF exfiltrates the information back to the attacker server. So finally you have this complete attack chain where no communication really is directly being exchanged between the attacker and the victim, but rather it's all being piped through Microsoft Teams, Microsoft's own infrastructure where they're looking up these GIFs, and obviously the stager is delivered through Microsoft Teams as well. So part one is the stager delivery through Teams, right? This is probably the crux of the research, because if you can't get this stager to run on the victim's machine, then you can't have this subsequent covert communications through GIFs. So we're going to walk through how we can convincingly deliver a stager through some vulnerabilities I discovered in Microsoft Teams. So first, it's important to highlight some of the basics of Microsoft Teams and some of the functionality around cross-tenant delivery. So as I had mentioned before, people in two different organizations or Microsoft tenants are allowed to chat with each other by default in Microsoft Teams, and the only way to turn that off is if your sort of IT administrator goes into the separate Teams 365 admin portal and turns off the ability to communicate with other organizations. Now you'll notice in the top corner there, file delivery and exchange of files with people in another organization is not permitted for obvious security reasons. And you can see here from Microsoft's own documentation, things your users can do. They're not allowed to share files across tenants because obviously there's the potential for delivering malicious files to someone from outside your organization into your organization through Teams. So first we're going to go ahead and walk through kind of the anatomy of a basic file delivery to, let's say, a user in your own company. So if I go ahead and I want to send a colleague of mine, Chris, a message, an image of a blue circle. So I can go ahead and click and drag that image into Microsoft Teams, and the first thing Teams is going to do is it's going to upload the content of that file to a custom SharePoint link that is generated for you. So in this case, the name of my company is Bobby Arsek, so Microsoft generates a SharePoint URL, bobbyarsek.sharepoint.com, and it uploads the content of this file to SharePoint. Secondly, it sends a subsequent JSON payload to a Microsoft Teams endpoint, essentially containing this large JSON file, which we're going to walk through, containing all the details of that SharePoint file and what should appear and what should be delivered to the end user. So finally, you can see here we have successfully uploaded this image of a blue circle and sent it to another colleague within our organization. And you can see here on the side I've included the JSON payload. So essentially the JSON body has a few properties. It has this client message ID, which is a unique numeric identifier associated with that individual Teams message. It has a series of parameters that are repeated over and over. You can see like base URL, file URL, SharePoint URL, but essentially it's the same SharePoint URL that Microsoft generated for this file. You can see here it takes the title of the file, the type of the file, in this case a PNG, and it also includes this preview URL. So there's a separate URL that's actually generated by Skype. Microsoft Teams, believe it or not, still leverages a lot of Skype infrastructure. So the preview is a Skype URL, and that's kind of the blue circle that's presented for you. So Microsoft Teams tries to render a preview of that file if it's able to, so if it's a video, image, GIF, etc. So let's say I go ahead and I send a message, a text message to a user in another organization, just saying the word hi. So you can see here in the top, the JSON payload is just the word hi. It's a rich text HTML payload. And then alongside that is this unique client message ID. So I thought, okay, what if we take the same JSON payload that I had sent to a user in my own organization containing this blue circle file attachment, but I just go ahead and swap in the client message ID. Can I then send this entire JSON payload to a user in another organization, and somehow this file will be delivered despite Microsoft saying that files cannot be exchanged cross-tenant or cross-organization? So sure enough, if I go ahead and send that same payload to a user in another organization, the file has successfully been delivered, and you can see here, despite the fact that Microsoft's own UI sort of blocks even the dragging of attachments, there's no paperclip icon present, I've successfully delivered this file to a user in another organization. So this is the first example of one of Microsoft's permission boundaries being bypassed. So the next question becomes it's certainly an interesting design decision to allow kind of this client-controlled JSON payload to be utilized for sending files to users. So the immediate thought was, how can we leverage this for potential attachment spoofing and maybe getting a user to click on a file that they believe is a legitimate file, but in fact redirects them to some sort of attacker-controlled URL with a malicious file. So as I mentioned, we can put in our own unique client message ID, and in all the instances where before it was asking for a SharePoint URL to be provided, what if we swap that out with a malicious URL? So in this case, I put my website, Bobby Arsek, and I included that in all of the JSON parameters where it asked for a URL. Now it's interesting here, under file type, instead of saying what the file type is, like a PNG, which Microsoft Teams is going to try and render. So if I claim that the file is a PNG, Microsoft Teams will essentially say that the file delivery failed because it doesn't know how to render the PNG if the ultimate PNG file doesn't exist or is not there. But if we say that the file type is some unrenderable type, which Microsoft Teams can't render for a user, like a DLL file, it'll go ahead and just appear as sort of this generic standard file attachment, and Microsoft Teams then won't subsequently try and render it on behalf of the user. So even though it's not a DLL, we'll just say it's a DLL, so it ultimately arrives to the end user. You can see here we can title it anything we want. In this case, I call it a Christmas party photo.jpg. And then finally, you can see here that the previous file preview URL, which was that Skype URL before, has been removed. So this way, Microsoft doesn't once again try and render a file that doesn't exist. So if we go ahead and send that JSON payload to a user in another organization, you can see here they get a very convincing attachment that says it is called christmaspartyphoto.jpg. If they hover over for introspection to make sure that this is actually what it is, they'll see that it also says christmaspartyphoto.jpg. So there's literally no way for a user to tell that this file is malicious other than them proceeding to click on the link. And this also bypasses any of the controls that Microsoft Teams and Office 365 puts in place for malicious attachments, because all of that scanning as to whether it's a malicious attachment or not occurs within the SharePoint infrastructure. But we're just bypassing that completely by simply changing out all the SharePoint URLs with URLs to our own link. So this won't be detected by any of their mitigating controls. And this is a brief demo just showing that a user, you can see the little external tag, so it's coming from a user in another organization, but they hover over the photo, they click it, they want to go ahead and open up and see what the JPEG is, and now we've successfully dropped the stager on their machine. So that's one way to go about delivering the stager. But I was curious how else we could go ahead and potentially leverage this attachment spoofing to leverage Microsoft's own URI file schema. So as I was looking through Microsoft Teams documentation and some of their blog posts, I noticed that Microsoft Teams supports something called deep linking, where essentially I could send you a URL, and instead of HTTP, it's MS-Teams:, and then you can include a series of actions that you want carried out. So maybe that's opening up a chat prompt and sending a message to a specific user, or maybe it's opening up a link to a survey within Microsoft Teams that you want that user to fill out. So if you're on a Microsoft machine or a Mac machine actually, and you click an MS-Teams link, it'll go ahead and open up Teams on your machine and carry out said action. So I thought this was interesting, and this was also around the time when Felina was big in the news and folks were leveraging the MS-DT file schema, so I thought there potentially was more to explore there. So if we dive into the Microsoft documentation around Microsoft URI schemes, you can see here in addition to Microsoft Teams, there's several other schemes supported like MS Word, MS PowerPoint, MS Excel. So if we just pick one, let's say MS Excel, we look in the appendix of the documentation, you can see here that the MS Excel file scheme actually supports this command called open for view, or OFU, or OFV pipe U pipe. So essentially, you can send someone a Microsoft Excel link starting with MS Excel:. You can include OFU pipe U followed by the URL that you want that user to visit. And if a user clicks that link, Excel will immediately open up and try and fetch an XLS document from said URL. So I thought we could potentially leverage this as part of kind of our permissions boundary bypass and this attachment spoofing. So let's say we go ahead and change all the instances of where before it had kind of this attacker's malicious URL, but now we include this m0leCon file scheme and we link it to, let's say we have already have a foothold within an internal network and we have an SMB share stood up with that environment. So let's go ahead and include a link to our IP and our SMB share called Rauch. The XLS file can exist or not exist, it doesn't matter. As soon as the user clicks that link, Excel will open up on their machine and Excel will try and fetch that link. So the first way we can leverage this is through NTLM hash hijack. So if SMB is turned on within their organization and they go ahead and click the same Christmas party photo link, if SMB signing is turned on, we can still capture their NTLM v2 hash and we can go ahead and crack that offline. And as you can see, I'll go ahead and take that hash, put it into hashcat, crack it, and we find out that user's password is Cali123. And we can also leverage this if SMB signing is turned off for an NTLM relay attack. So we can go ahead and turn on responder with proxy chains, and as soon as the user clicks this malicious attachment, their NTLM hash will be forwarded to the attacker, who forwards it to the domain controller, and now we have command execution under the permissions of the person who clicked the link. So you can imagine a low permissioned user who has a foothold within the organization, wants to, say, access the CEO's email. They can send a very convincing Teams attachment to the CEO. They click the link, and now essentially we could have code execution under the permissions of the CEO. So once again, looking back at the high-level overview, we've kind of walked through part one, which was the stager delivery, the stager execution. I felt like, okay, now we had at least proven out a very basic proof of concept of how we could convincingly deliver the stager that we want executed on the victim's machine. So now let's go ahead and proceed into the covert communications and the crux of the talk, which is the GIF communication. So if we walk through the anatomy of Microsoft Teams GIF functionality, so by default, GIFs are supported within Microsoft Teams, but you have to select one of the GIFs from their specified sort of GIF library. But I thought, let's say you want to use your own GIF. Well, I can go ahead and click and drag a GIF in, but Teams is going to go ahead and treat that like an attachment and upload it to SharePoint, just as we saw with the blue circle. So thinking back to kind of the JSON payload and the anatomy of a Teams file that we had walked through before, what if we take, if we look at a sample message like the word hi, once again it's rich text HTML. So I thought, okay, let's say I have a base64 encoded GIF in an SRC tag of an HTML image tag as an attribute. Can we go ahead and pass that in to sort of that content for a Teams message, and can we then send our own base64 encoded GIF just as part of the body of the message, bypassing any sort of the file uploading to SharePoint functionality? So you can see here, if I go ahead and pass in this case, this Pikachu GIF, I can pass it in as part of the content of one of my Microsoft Teams messages, just to demonstrate that I have full control of the message. I included the word, paving and roads after, just some random text. So you can imagine a scenario where an incident responder is looking at some sort of chat log. All they see are a bunch of GIFs being exchanged back and forth. They're talking about the latest meeting that occurred, and it all seems like innocuous business communication within a corporate environment. But when in actuality, we have included kind of this, our own base64 encoded GIF. So I thought, okay, how can we potentially leverage this functionality to deliver malicious commands covertly to a victim? Well, we can write a simple Python script to essentially carry out a steganography of hiding commands within a base64 encoded GIF. So we can go ahead and read any GIF we want. We can go ahead and append whatever command we want after the final semicolon in the base64 encoded GIF content. We can then go ahead and essentially do some UTF encoding, convert it to bytes, convert it back, and then base64 encode it. And now essentially if we look at the output of a GIF that's been injected, you can see here I've appended the who am I command to the standard Pikachu GIF. Microsoft Teams and Google Slides still treats it as a normal GIF, rendering it, nothing changes about its functionality, but now we've hidden this command within because a lot of these platforms seem to ignore whatever comes after the final semicolon of a base64 encoded GIF. So now to the second question of, okay, so let's say we hide a command within this GIF, we deliver it to a victim. Well, where is all this information stored? Well, it's actually stored within plain text on Windows and Mac machines. You can see here within this https teams.microsoft.com .leveldb folder. There's a log file contained within there, and this is from Trustwave, who figured this out. Essentially, if you just strings that log and just grep out for all the instances of divs, you go ahead and see here every single Microsoft Teams message that is exchanged back and forth, which is concerning in its own right, particularly within corporate environments if you're chatting about sensitive client details or any sensitive information at all. To know that it's just in plain text in this log file is a bit concerning, as Trustwave pointed out. We're going to go ahead and leverage that for our covert communication purposes. So we talked about hiding messages within a base64 encoded GIF, but I talked about in one of the earlier slides what happens if you send a URL to a GIF within a Microsoft Teams message. So you can see here I've sent a canary tokens link, and at the end I've called it test.gif. If I send that to any Microsoft Teams user, Microsoft actually tries to fetch that image on behalf of the user from this out-of-bound request from this url.p.asm.skype.url. So the Skype infrastructure tries to fetch that GIF on behalf of the user. So you can see here, we get a canary alert that our token was triggered. And as you can see, it always comes from a different Microsoft data center, sometimes in Brazil, sometimes Africa. But all over the world, there's some sort of Skype infrastructure that is looking up GIFs on behalf of users. So the final step in kind of this covert communication, which we'll review one more time in kind of the high-level diagram, but essentially Microsoft Teams supports webhooks. So without any sort of authentication tokens required, registration, Teams accounts, anyone can go ahead and create a Microsoft Teams webhook, which essentially allows anyone to send a simple JSON payload to that webhook, and then that payload will appear as a Microsoft Teams message within that webhook channel. So a simple curl URL saying hello world to a specified webhook will just send that message as if it was a standard Microsoft Teams message without needing to be signed in or be any sort of Microsoft Teams user. So I thought, okay, how can we go ahead and leverage this as part of our exfiltration of whatever command that we hid within our GIF? So Microsoft Teams supports something called message cards or cards. And essentially, you can include kind of these more complex JSON payloads. And this allows you to support something like maybe asking colleagues in your organization to fill out a survey or asking them to fill out a response with their t-shirt size to m0leCon. So it's quite customizable. And one of the attributes of a Microsoft Teams card is this activity image. So I thought, okay, what if we kind of leverage the lack of authentication around webhooks? We include covertly kind of this URL containing the base64 encoded output of whatever command that we hid within our GIF and then executed, and then we use that as a message of data exfiltration. So anyone looking, if you're an incident responder, if you're looking at the Microsoft Teams messages back and forth, you would see just a standard, in this case it's asking, can you solve this math problem that is baffling the internet? It appears like a standard question you might, or standard survey that's, let's say, sent out in a corporate environment. And you can see here this little thumbnail on the top left, that's actually the GIF URL that Microsoft tries to render on behalf of the user. Obviously can't because it doesn't exist, but at that point our data has been exfiltrated through Skype and through Microsoft Teams' own infrastructure back to the attacker's server. So once again, if you're looking at kind of this, I'll go ahead and show the out-of-bounds lookup demo first. Sorry, we're going off an Android hotspot here, so. Well, we could skip the video, but essentially it's just demonstrating this out-of-bounds lookup from the Skype URL from this Microsoft Teams card. So once again, just one more time, the high-level overview. We have our stager convincingly delivered to the victim. We then, this stager is essentially regularly scanning the Microsoft Teams log files, looking for plain text incoming base64 encoded GIFs. So it's constantly looking for incoming GIFs. We as the attacker can then repeatedly send GIFs to our victim containing the commands that we want executed. The stager will then execute these system commands. It'll go ahead and base64 encode the output of that command to the end of our attacker-controlled endpoint, and we'll append .gif at the end. We'll go ahead and then send that within a Microsoft Teams webhook, disguised as kind of one of these standard surveys or questionnaires sent out. Microsoft Teams will then go ahead and render the URL contained within on behalf of the user, so thus looking up this GIF and exfiltrating the command output back to the attacker's server from one of their many Skype or Microsoft URLs from around the world. This is kind of the entire attack chain of stager delivery and then covert C2 leveraging a series of Microsoft Teams functionality around GIFs and files. See if maybe I escape out of the slides for a sec, if I could show you the proof of concept. So you can see here, I've linked at the end a QR code with the Python C2 code that I wrote, along with the PowerShell stager that I was utilizing with this proof of concept. But essentially, we have this Python C2. It listens for incoming lookups of GIFs on a specified port. It then prompts the user to enter whatever command they would like executed on the victim's machine. As soon as they click enter, it'll go ahead and kind of conduct that Python script we had shown before. So it hides that who am I command within the Pikachu GIF, sends that to the victim. The stager is already running on the victim's machine because we delivered it through our convincing attachment, spoofing, and lack of permissions, boundaries, vulnerabilities. So it'll then, the stager then sends the base64 encoded output appended to the GIF URL. You can see here that the webhook is successfully getting these messages back. And now we have this full attack chain, and if you were looking at this from an incident response case, or if you were just, let's say, looking at Microsoft Teams traffic, nothing would particularly jump out to you as unusual about this. Now you may be wondering, well, this is great, but like a lot of times users, may not be on Microsoft Teams. They may not be looking at these random incoming messages. What if they've closed out Teams for the night and they're offline? Well, Microsoft Teams actually continues to run as a background process even if you close out of Microsoft Teams. So if you click the red X in Microsoft Teams, you shut your computer lid for the night and you leave, Microsoft Teams will still continue to deliver these GIFs, and our attack chain will continue to run as normal. You can see here, if all they'll get is kind of the little alert in the bottom right, letting them know that they got some text included in a Microsoft Teams message. So you could presumably carry this out while a user's offline, or even while a user's online, just simply including text along with your GIF that looks like standard business communications. And then you can see the PowerShell stager running there that's doing all the scanning of the GIFs, base64 encoding the output of those commands executed as system commands and sending it to the webhook. No, it's fine. Yeah, we're good. Thank you. So a follow-up question folks had is this already being leveraged in the wild? Maybe not this entire kind of covert communication, attachment spoofing GIF idea, but maybe parts of it are. So just looking through a standard CrowdStrike malware query, we can see here that there's 25 different malware samples that are accessing Microsoft Teams plain text log files. So for example, business spyware Variato is exfiltrating every single user's entire Microsoft Teams chat history as soon as that's executed on a user's machine. And the Skype URL that I had mentioned that is conducting these out-of-bound GIF lookups on behalf of users is being leveraged by GanCrab ransomware to exfiltrate information from corporate environments. So parts of this attack chain have been already seen in the wild. So I just want to walk through kind of the series of some, you might say, vulnerabilities, other you might say maybe misconfigurations, or maybe just overall insecure system design that allowed this to occur. I should highlight as well that I did look for this behavior in Zoom and Slack and Cisco WebEx and a series of other common corporate chat platforms, and none of this behavior and this entire kind of attack chain was possible in any of the other platforms except for Microsoft Teams. So as we outlined, when a new tenant is created in Microsoft, by default, Microsoft Teams allows for external senders to send messages to users in your organization, and many folks weren't even aware that there's this separate Microsoft Teams 365 portal where you can control these settings. Secondly is this permission boundary that we bypassed, which is supposed to disallow external senders from sending files to a user in another tenant. Third, we demonstrated that file attachments can be easily spoofed. They're using client-controlled input to control kind of this file delivery, and also they're not sanitizing whether the URL is included in one of these JSON payloads is a legitimate SharePoint URL. Fourth is that Microsoft Teams is storing all messages in plain text, which can allow a simple stage payload to scan for new content appended, or like we outlined, malicious ransomware or business spyware to exfiltrate entire Microsoft Teams chat logs. Number 5, the reading of these Microsoft Teams chat logs does not require any sort of elevated or administrative privileges, which allows for kind of this low privilege stager to run and scan the log files. The out-of-bounds lookups of GIFs is not inherently insecure, but they're not limiting the names of file lengths. So essentially you can include a 10,000 character string .gif, and Microsoft's infrastructure will still try and look up the name of that GIF. So by not including file name lengths, they're allowing their own infrastructure to be leveraged for potentially malicious communication or data exfiltration. Number 8, Microsoft Teams messages being sent to an individual are simple post requests with JSON bodies. There's no sort of CSRF protection, no complex tokenization in place. Microsoft Teams actually has their own API called the Graph API, which is supposed to be utilized for sending and receiving Microsoft Teams GIFs in a programmatic way. And they include a whole host of restrictions on rate limiting and what types of URLs and attachments can be sent as part of utilizing the Graph API. But you can actually just bypass all their controls by taking their relatively simple message and file delivery system to automate it yourself using, let's say, a Python request module. And finally, the sending of Microsoft Teams messages to a public webhook. As I outlined, post requests with simple JSON bodies don't require any authentication, registration, etc., have no CSRF or rate limiting protections, and this allowed us to simply exfiltrate our information through one of these Microsoft Teams cards. So I ended up reporting this vulnerability to Microsoft in 3 lengthy, detailed reports, similar to the content you're seeing in the slides today. And they said that, well, this is great, this is in quotes, well, this is great research, and the engineering team will endeavor to improve these areas over time. They tried to argue that this is post-exploitation, and they didn't really see the issue around the attachment spoofing, the permission boundary being bypassed, which knowing Microsoft is not that big of a surprise, but it was still interesting to hear the response, and they gave me permission to blog or present my findings publicly about the attack chain I discovered, and this was present in the Microsoft Teams version at the time. This was back in May and June 2022, and it still remains present. You can go ahead and take my proof of concept code and conduct this entire attack chain still. So GIFShell in the press, it ended up making the news via Lawrence Abrams from Bleeping Computer, who did a great story kind of outlining my research, and he was also able to reach out to Microsoft for comment, and they kind of reflected the same message, that they actually ended up backtracking and saying that they agree that the permission boundary was bypassed and that there are issues in file attachment spoofing. It just isn't on their priority list to remediate immediately, and then several other media publications ended up picking up the research as well, which was cool to see. I think the most interesting part for me was seeing the aftermath and the public response. So a few days later, after my research came out, another security research firm came out and said that, oh, actually not only are messages being stored in plain text, but actually all auth tokens are being stored in a separate file in one of the Microsoft Teams subfolders as well. And that proceeded to make big news. Once again, Microsoft said that it's not on their priority list to fix, and it's by design, but that was interesting to see. A few weeks later, Microsoft came out and said that they're going to allow Office 365 and Microsoft Teams users to report messages they receive from outside of their organization as phishing. I can't say I attribute this to my research, but certainly interesting to see thereafter, shortly in the aftermath of my research. And then Microsoft Defender added command and control traffic detection. You may wonder how good is their monitoring, and would Microsoft themselves be able to pick up on the GIFShell attack? Well, Anton from Assurgent Security did his own analysis and replicated my entire attack chain, and essentially he tested it against Defender for Endpoint and Microsoft Sentinel, and without some very specific kind of monitoring queries, the attack was essentially entirely undetectable. And from his perspective, the best mitigation was just to block your tenant, if you're an IT administrator, from allowing users in other organizations to send people within your organization any messages at all. So just closing thoughts and citations. I think this is important for organizations to continue to regularly conduct threat modeling and think about not only all the places where vulnerabilities may occur, but how attackers may be leveraging basic functionality or system design in a malicious way. Obviously, always patch low severity vulnerabilities. And I think it's also interesting to think about, large technology companies are constantly making decisions around assumed risk. If you've ever worked as a security consultant, you'll often have conversations around a finding you have, and the business has essentially accepted the fact that X functionality should exist in order to achieve some larger business objective, and this is an assumed risk that they're taking in order to achieve this business objective. But what happens if an organization, in this case, let's say Microsoft and the Teams system design folks, they conducted all their threat models, and over time, a series of decisions were made around how Teams messages should be delivered, who we want Teams messages to be delivered to. And each of these kind of maybe business decisions they made, they took some small amount of assumed risk in pursuit of this business objective, but they didn't think about how someone could chain together, let's say, a series of this lower assumed risks into potentially something that is more severe. So I think about whether you're running a cybersecurity for an organization or you're looking for vulnerabilities yourself, maybe think about not like a vulnerability class like XSS or something, but think about how we can leverage basic system design functionality for our benefit. Finally, I included a link to my Twitter as well. If you have any questions following up, I'm not sure if we have time for questions. We have time for questions now, so I'll answer questions. So I'm on Twitter. You can also check out my website, bobbyarsec.com, where I chronicle all my research and podcasts, etc. The QR code on the left is a link to my website, and the QR code on the right is a link to the GitHub repository that contains all the source code for my Python C2 that was utilized for this, as well as the PowerShell stager. And I include documentation on there as well as how you can go ahead and replicate this entire attack chain. And as soon as this research did come out, I did receive several Twitter DMs from different OffSec and red teamers who were asking questions about how to kind of replicate the attack chain for their own operations. So if you have any questions, feel free to DM me. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Were there any difference between the web version of Microsoft Teams and the desktop version? So were the experiments run on the desktop version or the web one?
Yeah, so I actually leveraged the web version to conduct kind of those out-of-bound lookups of GIF URLs from Skype infrastructure, because the clearest way to quickly debug if those requests were being sent were from the web version. Obviously, the web version doesn't have kind of those, I guess, plain text logs stored locally on a user's machine, But the same auth tokens are being utilized with the desktop applications as the web version. The same JSON payloads and message delivery is exactly the same. Obviously, the Teams desktop application is Electron based. So really, the same functionality is there, minus kind of the plain text storing of the Teams message logs. Sure.
Since it comes from the same infrastructure from Skype, does that mean that Skype has the same issues? It means I can exploit these issues on Skype too.
Yeah, so it seems like Microsoft over the years has a habit of kind of taking a hodgepodge of acquisitions and sort of turning it into larger system design. So if you try and open like Skype for Business now on your machine, it doesn't really, like the application exists, but it then just redirects you to Microsoft Teams. So there really is no truly like Skype in, or Skype for Business anymore. They're trying to migrate everyone to Teams. So the Skype infrastructure still exists underneath, but I guess the UI and from the user perspective, it's all Teams. So it's this mishmash of SharePoint, Teams, Skype.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Maybe just more of a general question. So how frustrating was it for you to get such a response after that amazing work? I mean, it must be so frustrating.
It's funny you say that because one of the interesting parts that I didn't actually cover in the slides was I kind of submitted these 3 larger reports around all this research I had done. And then as like a 5-10 minute like one-off, I submitted another kind of attachment spoofing vulnerability in another part of Microsoft Teams, which was essentially identical to the other 3 reports I had submitted and you know, mimics the content in these slides. And within like 7 days, they paid out like the highest severity $3,000 bounty for that report. But then the other 3, they didn't see any issue with them or the boundaries being bypassed. So the whole thing never made much sense to me. It's not a surprise to me. The Apple research as well. I reported essentially my Apple research that Brian Krebs had covered was I discovered a stored XSS in an Apple AirTag. So anyone who tapped their phone to an AirTag would immediately be victimized because a link would pop up on their computer or on their phone that would be a malicious one, even though they're just tapping a standard Apple AirTag. And I reported that to Apple, and they essentially didn't respond at all and just ignored me for 90 days, which is why I went public for it. So I'm constantly trying to push for kind of that 90-day public disclosure. I'm really not all that interested in kind of the monetary output of the research. I more care about being able to share, you know, interesting research with folks like you. So it wasn't a surprise. Sure, it's always, I guess, a little frustrating when they don't pay the proper attention. But that's kind of my goal in research, is to draw more attention to kind of how organizations handle vulnerability reports and vulnerability mitigation. And I think also, you know, on their priority level, in fairness to Microsoft, they're getting so many reports about high severity vulnerabilities all the time, oftentimes in their own products that affect Microsoft themselves. And I think those vulnerabilities are higher on their kind of focus list than something that potentially victimizes one of their customers leveraging a Microsoft product. So I think it's just the nature of kind of how Microsoft run things. And I'll add also, Microsoft kind of runs their vulnerability reporting program in quite a unique way. The MSRC, they don't actually dictate if a bounty should be paid out, if a vulnerability should or should not be fixed. They're simply acting as an intermediary between me and the Microsoft Teams engineering team. So they can't even go to the engineering team and say, you must fix this. It all comes down to the engineering team and what they want to do, and they're simply acting as an intermediary. And I found out about this from this long Twitter thread that a Microsoft employee posted about how things work on the inside. So just kind of I guess, behind the curtain, how it looks behind the scenes. So.
How much do you spend on this research?
How much time did I spend on it?
Yes.
So over the years, I've kind of observed kind of the interesting behavior around this cross-tenant communication, the GIFs, so I kind of just kept stacking up little observations over the years. I think I started formalizing the research last December, so I worked on it like December through April, reported it in May and June, kind of pushed Microsoft over the coming 90 days for their, to either fix it or have me publicly disclose it, which I proceeded to do. That bleeping computer came out in September, and I'm here today. So I guess that's the full timeline. The research itself, I'd say roughly 4 months.
did you conduct the entirety of this research by yourself, or did you ask for some help or support or peer verification? How does the process with other people work when doing research like this?
I'm sorry, is the question around what in my research process? Sorry, it's hard to hear.
Yeah, what your research process is, what, the 4 months you spent, was it entirely you working on this? Did you have peers helping you out? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my research process is kind of like me drawing crazy ideas on my office whiteboard, coming up with some sort of idea for research, testing it out over a series of weeks or months, proceeding to then kind of put it together in a basic outline of what a blog post is. I then chat with a bunch of other, Red Team and OffSec friends I have, sharing kind of the draft of the blog post I have, ways to improve my research, have them kind of proofread it over, see if they can come up with any other ways I can leverage this. And then from there, I'll push out my research on my Medium blog, which is medium.com/BobbyRsec, and then whatever press picks it up from there, I go along with that. So,
Okay, thank you.
I should say that collaborative research is a good idea. Sometimes it's just a little crazy to try and get someone on board with Microsoft Team GIF nonsense until it's formalized into something a bit more robust, I guess.
Let's thank again Bobby for his nice talk.